LGB. 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 LGB.
They say LGB everywhere I go. LGB. What it means, I don't know. LGB. Whatever it is. LGB. Come on, help me, please. Please.
Alrighty then.
Thank you. LGB.
That's let's go, Brandon. Right?
LGB. This means let's go, Brandon. No. LGB.
Sounds like let's go, Brandon. I guess.
LGB. All right. Let's go, Brandon.
I am Cornholio.
Chant LGB. Right wing and left wing. LGB. So you know the thing. LGB. If you don't sing that back. LGB. And you ain't black. LGB. Let's go, Brandon. LGB.
Let's go, Brandon.
LGB.
Let's go, Brandon.
FJB. Let's go, Brandon.
I'm Joe Biden, and I
Forgot
this message.
Greetings, my dear friends, and welcome to another episode of Reading Epic Threads. I'm your host, Patrick Gunnels, joining you today from Houston, Texas, this May 4th, 2024 at 3:01 p.m. Central Daylight Time. I will be presenting one piece that will be Joe Lange from Badlands Media, who is the real enemy. Before I get to that, I want to remind everybody, and I may have mentioned this already, I'm going to start doing some of my shows experimentally first live exclusively on X, formerly Twitter. The reason for that is because I have not gained a single new subscriber on Rumble in almost 2 years. This same complaint is something that is, it's not unique to me. I don't know why it is. But on believe it or not, on Twitter, I am actually able to get new subscribers. As a result of that, I am imploring you, please figure out a way to make use of the comments section in X. If you check the live now on X, just click on that. You can go in there and you can make use of that chat functionality, because you guys do chat in Rumble. Those of you who do, go to my Rumble streams, but you don't find a way to do it in the X live streams. I found it. It's right there. And then you can chat in it. And the chat interface is excellent if you can find it. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. And then hopefully by the end, when we have everybody here, we can chat about it and I can interact with you guys afterwards. I will take the recording of this and upload it to Rumble as a separate stream. All right. What do you say we actually begin? Without further ado, from Badlands Media, aka badlands.substack.com. Who is the real enemy? Wars and drug trafficking have funded the hidden enemy for generations. By Joe Lange. This feature is a follow-up to Profiting from War. Why was the BCCI, Bank of Credit and Commerce International, so important to the CIA, the Bush family, and Prince Al-Walid? It was a massive money spigot. They stole billions of dollars from depositors in over 70 countries and used it to fund terrorist groups and start wars in order to steal taxpayers' money in the trillions. BCCI was used to fund both sides of the Iran-Iraq war, Iran-Contra, and drug cartels. It was also used to fund the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which would morph into Al-Qaeda. George W. Bush would later declare Al-Qaeda public enemy number one. Everything is connected. Let's step back and look at the big picture. The CIA/shadow government set up by George H.W. Bush was controlling the drug trade worldwide and starting wars, both to protect that drug trafficking and to steal money from taxpayers who were funding all the wars. It was a constant money spigot of funding for the cabal, and it was purposely centered around the Middle East. The Middle East was being set up as a war zone to promote constant fear and expenditure of money along with lives in order to create a never-ending war on terror. BCCI was at the center of that war against terrorism. It started out as a bank in Pakistan. That wasn't a coincidence. Pakistan had some of the most lax banking laws, and their intelligence service, known as ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, was directly connected to the CIA. The BCCI Ponzi scheme lasted as long as it did because it was connected to the CIA and the intelligence agencies of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Why was Pakistan so important? For three reasons. The lack of strict banking standards in Pakistan allowed the CIA to fund many operations in the Middle East through BCCI. Pakistan was also at the center of the proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world. That wasn't a coincidence. I will go deeper into that in my next article. One of the most important CIA operations happening in Pakistan was funding and arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. They were fighting against the Soviet Union, who had invaded Afghanistan at the end of 1979. But why did the Soviet Union invade Afghanistan? What was the real reason? Do you remember the narrative that was pushed on the American people regarding the invasion? It was a media narrative that I don't remember anybody questioning. The basic narrative was this: we were involved in a Cold War, and the Soviet Union was an evil communist empire that was always looking to expand communism around the world. Afghanistan was just their latest conquest. What is wrong with that narrative? It wasn't the Soviet Union that was expanding worldwide. It was the CIA/shadow government. The CIA expansion into the Middle East was a direct threat to the Soviet Union, and that's what triggered the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. As I have been laying out in this long series, the CIA has been overthrowing governments and installing dictators in order to protect their worldwide drug trafficking. And they were using the Cold War with the Soviet Union as the reason for their actions. The entire Cold War narrative was the excuse that the CIA/shadow government used to fight proxy wars all over the world and to steal taxpayers' money. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan turned out to be a pivotal point in world history. It marked the end of the Cold War narrative and the start of the never-ending war on terror. The cabal knew the Cold War was coming to an end, so they needed a new, never-ending war. That new war was the war on terror. But let's go back to the media narrative that was pushed on the American people. Was the Soviet Union, Russia, just trying to expand territory by invading Afghanistan and propping up another communist government, or was it something else? Did you know that Trump commented specifically on this subject and gave a completely different reason for the invasion? He was then bashed in the media for his comments and painted as a Russian sympathizer. Our history has been a complete lie. And Trump has often tried to reveal that to us. The Russian invasion of Afghanistan narrative was another lie. According to the Washington Post, quote, Trump's bizarre history lesson on the Soviet Union, Russia, and Afghanistan. President Trump said a lot of strange, untrue things after Wednesday's cabinet meeting, but the most bizarre snippet might have been his history lesson on the Soviet Union. Trump, who has assured us he is the foremost expert on many topics for which he has no formal education or training, gave his own version of why the USSR collapsed. And to be clear, it is his own version. End quote. Who is telling the truth, Trump or the media? The media narrative just parrots what the CIA claims is the truth. They have lied to us for years about everything. They claim that Trump doesn't know what he's talking about or is flat out lying. Who has a better record of telling the truth over the past 7 years, Trump or the media? There's a reason Trump paints the media as the enemy of the people. Q drop number 2678 of February 9th, 2019. Link, NBCnews.com. Russian troll accounts purged, Twitter pushed QAnon, other conspiracy theories. Russia, Russia, Russia. Fake news attacks continue. Ask yourself, why? What happens when the news no longer reports facts? What happens when the news no longer reports truth? Enemy of the people. Controlled. Q. Q told us the media was controlled and that Trump was purposely exposing them. So what did Trump say that got the media to attack him? This is classic Trump. More from the Washington Post. Quote, here's what he said. Russia used to be the Soviet Union. Afghanistan made it Russia because they went bankrupt fighting Afghanistan. Russia, the reason Russia was in Afghanistan was because terrorists were going into Russia. They were right to be there. The problem is it was a tough fight, and literally they went bankrupt. They went into being called Russia again as opposed to the Soviet Union. You know, a lot of these places you're reading about now are no longer part of Russia because of Afghanistan. End quote. Trump is the master of the narrative, and he purposely invites the media attacks on what he says in order to draw attention to a specific subject. He words his statements very carefully, knowing that the media will try their best to prove him wrong. They take the bait every single time. Trump mentioned Russia over and over in this statement for a reason. It's a siren call to the CIA-controlled media who are desperate to pin Russian collusion on Trump. The corrupt political insurgency had spent valuable time and effort on their framing of Trump on Russian collusion during the 2016 election, and Special Counsel Robert Mueller had exonerated Trump of all charges. The Democrats had just impeached Trump for the first time on abuse of power and obstructing Congress, and they were wasting valuable ammo in this narrative war. Trump wanted them to keep expending ammunition on Russian collusion because he had nothing to fear and knew the truth would prevail. But look at the specific points that Trump makes about Russia. I think most people realize now that the Soviet Union broke apart because their economy collapsed. The war in Afghanistan drained valuable resources and put them into massive debt. Trump uses the term bankrupt because wars are what put countries into debt and ultimately forces bankruptcy on them. The Soviet Union split up not long after they ended their decade-old war in Afghanistan. Russia then became one of the nations that was formed when the Soviet Union imploded. Trump is saying that the current Russia exists today because of what happened in Afghanistan. That is true. More from the Washington Post. Quote, the overlap between the fall of the Soviet Union and its foray into Afghanistan is obvious. The USSR invaded in 1979 and left a decade later in 1989. The superpower dissolved shortly thereafter in 1991. But correlation is not causation, and Trump, who was using that anecdote to argue that the United States should pull out of Afghanistan and Syria, is really straining for causation here. End quote. The correlation that Trump is focusing on is that a war in Afghanistan bankrupted the Soviet Union and was now bankrupting the United States. At the time, Trump was moving towards ending our own 20-year war in Afghanistan that had put the United States into massive debt and was driving us into bankruptcy. Trump's mission was to end all the wars. The CIA-controlled media was obviously against ending the ongoing war in Afghanistan because it was a constant money spigot. From day one, Trump has focused on turning off all of the enemy's money spigots. Money flow disruption weakens the enemy and their grip on power. Money equals power. If you cut off the money, the enemy has no power. But did you catch the most inflammatory part of Trump's quote? The reason Russia was in Afghanistan was because terrorists were going into Russia. They were right to be there. Trump knew this statement would catch the ire of the CIA-controlled media. This is how he set the hook to make them focus on this story. He said they were right to be there. Is Trump right? That goes completely against everything we've been told for years, and it sure seems like Trump is sympathetic to Russia, doesn't it? Why would Trump say such a thing? And who were the terrorists Trump was referring to? More from the Washington Post. The reason Russia was in Afghanistan was because terrorists were going into Russia. The Washington Post replies, this is simply not true. The Soviet Union ventured into Afghanistan as part of its effort to prop up communism abroad, not because terrorists were striking the Soviet homeland, end quote. The media says that what Trump said is simply not true. Really? Trump has declassified everything and knows what's been hidden from the American people. Let me ask the question again. Who were the terrorists that Trump was referring to? According to The Guardian, Ghosts of Afghanistan, Hard Truths and Foreign Myths by Jonathan Steele. Review. Quote, the Russians invaded in December 1979, not as a part of a plan for the world victory of communism, as our propaganda had it, but to protect the security of their southern frontier against Islamic unrest and American intrigue. Senior Soviet generals and officials had warned against getting mixed up in an Afghan civil war. They pointed to the unhappy precedent of Vietnam. Their leaders went ahead, nevertheless, as much as anything, because they could not think of a better alternative. Change the Afghan leader, train up his army and his police, and then they hoped the Soviet troops would be able to leave in a matter of months. It did not happen. The Russians were soon sucked into just the quagmire that the skeptics had feared. Before long, they were looking for a way out. End quote. The book's author, Jonathan Steele, based his view on declassified Soviet Union documents. The Soviet Union leadership was reluctant to get involved in Afghanistan, but they felt they had no choice. Why? To protect the security of their southern frontier against Islamic unrest and American intrigue. Islamic unrest? That sure sounds like terrorism. American intrigue? That's just a fancy term for the CIA. The CIA had been sponsoring terrorism throughout the Middle East since George H.W. Bush cut a deal to sell weapons to Iran. They had funded both sides of the Iran-Iraq war, and now they were using BCCI to fund the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. All of this unrest/terrorism in the Middle East was being directed by the CIA/shadow government through Pakistan. But do you know the real backstory on why the Soviet Union felt that it had no choice but to invade Afghanistan? A communist government had taken control of Afghanistan in 1978. So why would the Soviet Union invade the country a year later? Didn't they already control the country? Wasn't the Afghan government already a puppet of the Soviet Union? Do you want to know what really triggered the invasion? There was a coup that happened in Afghanistan before the Soviet Union invaded. Guess who was behind the coup? Here's the backdrop. According to The Diplomat, quote, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, the communist party that ruled the country from 1978 until 1992, remains largely forgotten in Afghanistan's long story of bloodshed. The PDPA had two main factions, the Khalq masses and the Parcham banner. Hafizullah Amin, who emerged as the leader in the radical Khalq faction, brutally eliminated his party rivals, forcibly disappeared thousands of Afghans, confounded the Soviet Union's leadership, and forced a series of foreign interventions that drastically sealed Afghanistan's fate for the next 40 years. End quote. There was a communist government in Afghanistan before the Soviet Union invaded the country, but there was a radical faction within that government that began killing off all of its rivals. This violent and radical group was led by Hafizullah Amin. Who is Hafizullah Amin? More from The Diplomat. Quote, Amin was born in 1929 outside of Kabul. An ethnic Pashtun, He came from an intellectual background, having studied education at Columbia University in New York City, where he also adopted his Marxist ideology. The hard-lined and disciplined Amin was soon dissatisfied with the PDPA's rule after the coup and outmaneuvered his predecessor and fellow Khalq faction member Nur Mohammad Taraki by staffing the PDPA's Politburo with Amin loyalists. Leonid Brezhnev tried to prevent Taraki's murder, but Amin had him killed in October 1979, a move which deeply rattled the Soviets. End quote. Hafizullah Amin was second in command of the communist government in Afghanistan, and he was the one who controlled most of the military. He was killing and torturing tens of thousands of Afghans before he led a military coup and killed Taraki in order to take control of the country. More from the diplomat. Quote, Afghans of the older generation still remember the days of Amin, just like today's conspiracy narratives, including one that the United States created the so-called Islamic State group. Similar tropes existed in 1979. Fahim, 67, a mining engineer at the time, thinks Amin was on the payroll of the CIA. Quote, whatever he did benefited the Americans, which proved he was an American chess piece. His actions caused a split inside the PDPA and weakened the party. As a second-in-chief of the party, led by Nur Mohammad Taraki, he did everything arbitrarily and in a dictatorial manner, says Fahim. He adds that Amin's loyalists may have his picture on their wall, and some may call him a patriot, but he was a bloodthirsty ruler whose savageries were later repeated by the notorious Hizb-e-Aslami under Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. End quote. It wasn't a conspiracy narrative that the United States created ISIS or that Amin was a CIA asset. More on ISIS in a coming article. Remember that name, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. I'll come back to him. Many people in Afghanistan who lived through Amin's bloody regime believed he was taking orders and was on the payroll of the CIA who had staged the coup. More from the diplomat. Quote, Abdul Hadi, 63, was a university student at the time of Amin's 100 days of rule in Afghanistan. Quote, today's miseries all trace back to Hafizullah Amin's actions, he says, adding that Amin was a U.S.-trained man and an American pawn who resorted to forced disappearance and burying people alive indiscriminately from any ethnic groups of the society in order to incite the people against the Soviet-backed communist regime. End quote. The Soviet Union felt it had no choice but to invade Afghanistan to avoid increased terrorism on their southern border and to prevent possible American missiles on that same southern border. The CIA forced their hand, and the result was millions of lives lost, along with the acceleration of the CIA's sponsorship and promotion of terrorism in the Middle East, all now centered around Afghanistan. None other than the New York Times hinted at the same thing without naming the CIA. According to the New York Times, quote, we have been receiving information about Amin's behind-the-scenes activities, which might mean his political reorientation to the West. Yuri V. Andropov, the KGB chief, told the Soviet leader Leonid I. Brezhnev in a handwritten memo in December 1979, quote, he keeps his contacts with the American chargé d'affaires secret from us, end quote. The Andropov memo was made public in 1995 when Anatoly F. Dobrynin, the longtime ambassador to the United States, went to the Russian archives and transcribed documents for a project by the Norwegian Nobel Institute. At a meeting on December 8, 1979, also transcribed by Mr. Dobrynin, Mr. Andropov and Dmitry F. Ustinov, the defense minister, cited the dangers of American missiles being deployed in Afghanistan. The picture Andropov is painting in early December is that if Amin did a flip, it would totally change the geopolitical balance in South Asia. Mr. Blanton said it would be as if Mexico became a base for Soviet short-range missiles. How would we feel? End quote. The Soviets knew that Amin was meeting secretly with the CIA and that their southern border was now threatened. The Soviet Union sent special forces into Kabul to kill Amin and control the city as they invaded Afghanistan. What happened in Afghanistan back in 1979 wasn't much different from the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. In both instances, Russia was being threatened by a CIA-controlled shadow government that wasn't looking for peace, but instead was trying to destabilize their country and threaten them with missiles. Both Russian invasions were for defensive purposes, not conquest. The media continue to lie about both wars. Trump knows a lot more about the Afghanistan history than these few declassified documents prove, and I believe the terrorists he was referring to are the CIA, which is the biggest terrorist organization in the world. Now, let's go back to that name that was mentioned previously. Who is Gulbuddin Hekmatyar? According to Wikipedia, quote, Hekmatyar joined the Muslim Youth Organization as a student in the early 1970s, where he was known for his Islamic radicalism rejected by much of the organization. He spent time in Pakistan before returning to Afghanistan when the Soviet-Afghan War began in 1979, at which time the CIA began funding his rapidly growing Hezb-e-Islami Mujahideen organization through the Pakistani ISI. He received more CIA funding than any other Mujahideen leader during the Soviet-Afghan War. In the late 1980s, Hekmatyar and his organization used the funds and weapons provided to them by the CIA to start trafficking opium, and later moved into manufacturing heroin. He established himself and his group amongst the leading heroin suppliers in the Middle East. Given the CIA's connection, this became a subject of diplomatic embarrassment for the U.S. Foreign Service. End quote. The CIA handpicked Hekmatyar to control their heroin operation in Afghanistan and used the cover of Freedom Fighter and the Cold War in order to fund and arm him. His nickname was the Butcher of Kabul, and he was a protege of the CIA. The CIA is responsible for so many butchers of innocent people around the world during the shadow government expansion under George H.W. Bush. According to the National Post, quote, now, a new chapter in the pantomime has opened with the High Peace Council's rehabilitation of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the Butcher of Kabul, a sociopath who almost single-handedly turned the Afghan capital to rubble during the early 1990s, when as many as 50,000 people were slaughtered, and the city was reduced from a metropolis of 2 million to perhaps 500,000 shell-shocked, ragged, and half-mad survivors. A peace deal between Hekmatyar and the government of Ashraf Ghani is to be concluded this week. End quote. This CIA sociopath wasn't a freedom fighter as the media once proclaimed. He slaughtered tens of thousands of innocent Afghans and was listed as a terrorist at the UN Council, which was a designation the CIA had removed as part of this bogus peace deal. More from the National Post. Quote, Hekmatyar first came to public attention in the 1980s after murdering a fellow student at Kabul University. He went on to a lucrative career in drug trafficking and became prominent in Afghanistan's underworld, which allowed him to position his Hezb-e-Islami outfit to leverage more money and guns from the Americans and the Saudis than any of the 15 jihadist groups fighting the Soviets. During the post-Soviet anarchy and the rush for the spoils of war, Hekmatyar spent most of his time in 1992 to 1996 raining rockets and artillery shells on the people of Kabul, leaving the city a smoking tomb. End quote. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was at the center of the early days of heroin drug trafficking for the CIA in Afghanistan. That's why he was getting the most funding and weapons from the CIA. This is very important to understand. The CIA/shadow government literally created a private army to protect their heroin operation in Afghanistan. They were sold to the American people as freedom fighters. When the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan, a bloody civil war erupted that killed hundreds of thousands of Afghans. It was all about control of the heroin trade. Drug trafficking was at the heart of the BCCI Bank in Pakistan. According to fair.org, quote, the transfer of money allegedly destined for the Afghan rebels to various CIA-backed counter-revolutionary groups is just one of the scandals lurking behind the BCCI scandal. This bank was also a major channel for drug money laundered by corrupt Pakistani military officers who administered the CIA's arms pipeline to the Afghan rebels while supplying much of the heroin that inundated the US and Europe during the 1980s. A scandal Time, July 29th, 1991, briefly alluded to. Despite such revelations, U.S. news media continue to promote the Reagan-Bush administration's so-called war on drugs. End quote. All throughout the Reagan and Bush administrations, the American people were told that there was a war on drugs happening, as untold millions of dollars were being spent to supposedly stem the flow of CIA drugs into the United States. It was just another scam, a war to steal taxpayers' money. The CIA heroin operation in Afghanistan was disguised as just another battle in the Cold War and a way to support freedom fighters. It was a purposeful lie to the American people, and taxpayers' money was flowing to the very groups causing the heroin epidemic in America. We were funding our enemies. Afghanistan was a focus of the shadow government from the beginning. According to whowhatwhy.org, creating an international Islamist army, Casey, BCCI, and the creation of Al-Qaeda, quote, the other most significant case in which the CIA became a front for sanctioned violence was CIA Director William Casey's use of the CIA in the 1980s to promote his own plans for Afghanistan. Casey's Afghan initiatives aroused the concern of the CIA's professional operatives and analysts, including his deputy directors, Bobby Ray Inman and John McMahon. But this did not deter Casey from making high-level decisions about the Afghan campaign outside regular channels when meeting in secret with foreigners. One man Casey dealt with in this fashion was Aga Hassan Abedi, a close advisor to General Zia of Pakistan, and more important, the head of the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. End quote. William Casey was head of the CIA in the Reagan administration when George H.W. Bush was establishing the shadow government that would control the entire executive branch. As part of the shadow government, Casey worked outside of normal government channels and met secretly with foreign counterparts, including the close financial advisor to the president of Pakistan and the founder of the CIA-established BCCI Bank. Why keep it so secret? As I shared in my last article, the Bush family was completely connected to the BCCI scandal and were personally profiting from it. It was a massive money spigot. More from whowhatwhy.org, quote, unquestionably, BCCI offered Casey an opportunity to conduct off-the-books operations, such as the Iran-Contra arms deal in which BCCI was intimately involved. But the largest of these operations by far was the support to the Afghan Mujahideen resistance against the Soviet invaders, where once again BCCI played a major role. Casey repeatedly held similar meetings with General Zia in Pakistan, arranged by Abedi, and with Saudi intelligence chiefs Kamal Adham and Prince Turki Al Faisal, both BCCI shareholders. End quote. There were three main intelligence agencies running the BCCI scam: the CIA and the intelligence agencies from Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. More from whowhatwhy.org, quote, as a result of such conclaves, Prince Turki distributed more than $1 billion in cash to Afghan guerrillas, which was matched by another $1 billion from the CIA. Quote, when the Saudis provided the funding, the administration was able to bypass Congress. To access the CIA money was relatively easy. bags of dollar bills were flown into Pakistan and handed over to Lieutenant General Akhtar Abdurrahman, the ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence Director. Rahman banked the cash in ISI accounts held by the National Bank of Pakistan, the Pakistan-controlled Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, and the Bank of Oman, one-third owned by the BCCI, end quote. Pakistan is so essential to the CIA shadow government operations in the Middle East. In my next article, I'll dive deeper into Pakistan as I continue to set the table for the coming 9/11 article. More from whowhatwhy.org. Quote, Casey's involvement with BCCI was not just a backdoor operation with a bank. It was a multi-billion-dollar backdoor operation with a criminal bank accused, even by its own insiders, of global involvement with drug shipments, smuggled gold, stolen military secrets, assassinations, bribery, extortion, covert intelligence operations, and weapons deals. End quote. BCCI was set up for one purpose, and it wasn't to fight communism. What was the real purpose? More from whowhatwhy.org. Quote, there were huge and lasting historical consequences from Casey's apparently unilateral decision to work with BCCI. One was that BCCI's drug clients in Pakistan and Afghanistan, notably Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, emerged in the 1980s with protection from General Zia as dominant figures in an expanded Afghan heroin drug traffic that continues to afflict the world. According to McCoy, BCCI played a critical role in facilitating the movement of Pakistani heroin money that reached $4 billion by 1989, more than the country's legal exports. End quote. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was funded by the CIA through Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, and his protected heroin operation was bringing in billions for Bush and the shadow government. Pakistan was being used by Bush to protect this very lucrative drug trade. Bush and the CIA had literally cornered the market on the worldwide heroin trade. How big was it? They controlled the Golden Triangle in Asia, and now the Golden Crescent in Afghanistan. More from whowhatwhy.org. It is worth contemplating for a moment the legacy of CIA-supported drug proxies in just two areas: the Golden Triangle and the Golden Crescent. In 2003, according to the United Nations, these two areas accounted for 91% of the area devoted to illicit opium production and 95% of the estimated product in metric tons. Add in Colombia and Mexico, two other countries where the CIA has worked with drug traffickers, and the four areas accounted for 96.6% of the growing area and 97.8% of the estimated product. End quote. The CIA controlled almost 98% of the worldwide heroin trafficking because of their secret war in Laos during the Vietnam War and now the wars in Afghanistan. How many millions of innocent lives have been lost due to drug addiction promoted by the CIA? I know people personally whose lives have been ruined by heroin, which is why I feel the need to expose it all. These people are evil. When the CIA got involved, the drug trafficking massively increased because the money was more important than human lives. More from whowhatwhy.org. Quote, when the CIA airline CAT began its covert flights to Burma in the 1950s, the area produced about 80 tons of opium a year. In 10 years' time, production had perhaps quadrupled. And at one point during the Vietnam War, the output from the Golden Triangle reached 1,200 tons a year. By 1971, there were also at least 7 heroin labs in the region, one of which, close to the CIA base at Ban Hue Sai in Laos, produced an estimated 3.6 tons of heroin a year. That's how much the CIA increased heroin production in Laos. But what about Afghanistan? More from whowhatwhy.org. Quote, Afghan opium production has been even more responsive to U.S. operations in the area. It soared from 200 metric tons in 1980, the first full year of U.S. support for the drug trafficking Mujahideen Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, to 1,980 metric tons in 1990, when both the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to terminate their aid. After 1979, Afghan opium and heroin entered the world market significantly for the first time and rose from roughly 0 to 60% of U.S. consumption by 1980. In Pakistan, there were hardly any drug addicts in 1979. The number had risen to over 800,000 by 1992. End quote. The CIA-controlled media criticized Trump for saying that the Soviet Union dissolved because it went bankrupt fighting a war in Afghanistan. They said correlation is not causation. The media says that a war that drained valuable resources and severely damaged the Soviet Union's economy is not the reason that the nation collapsed and split up. The United States is around $35 trillion in debt. The interest payments are close to $1 trillion now, and we are spending $1 trillion every 100 days. How long until the United States goes bankrupt? How did our nation get strapped with all that debt? The CIA/shadow government has kept the nation in perpetual war since World War II, which has brought us to the brink of bankruptcy. We have only lasted this long because we are the world's reserve currency and can print as much money as we need. How about this correlation? 1. Did heroin trafficking massively increase because of the wars in Laos and Afghanistan? 2. Who was waging those wars in secret? 3. Why is the CIA connected to all the major drug trafficking groups worldwide? Who is the real enemy? Trump focused on Afghanistan for a reason. As I said earlier, Afghanistan represented the cabal's transition from a never-ending Cold War against the Soviet Union into a never-ending war on terror that was centered in the Middle East. War for profit. The Soviet Union collapsed after they lost the war in Afghanistan. Should have celebrated a great victory in the Cold War, and Afghanistan should have been better off because they had won their freedom from communism. But unfortunately, they never gained their freedom from the CIA and the shadow government. A bloody civil war began in Afghanistan, and it would be a defining moment in American history. Afghanistan was in chaos and was now going to be the focal point of the worldwide growth of terrorism. The CIA/shadow government was going to create a worldwide terror network in Afghanistan that would both protect their heroin trade and strike fear in the hearts of the American people in order to create support for a never-ending war on terror. Pakistan was the key. It was a purposeful safe haven for radical terrorists, and the CIA was behind it all. One person called it out because he actually cared about the Afghan people who were being sacrificed. According to Spiegel International, what does this contest of world powers have to do with the murderous struggle of the Taliban? Hamid Karzai. When things started to go wrong in Afghanistan around 2005, 2006, when the extremist terrorist attacks started, we talked to the U.S. about the different causes of the violence. We knew that these attacks were being organized by intelligence in Pakistan and carried out by the Taliban. The U.S. confirmed this independently, telling us, yes, the violence is coming from Pakistan, and yes, the Taliban's sanctuaries are there. But instead of investigating the root cause of the violence and going after it, Washington started to fund Pakistan's military. End quote. The Taliban was being funded, trained, and protected in Pakistan by the CIA. Karzai confronted the U.S. government on the fact that Pakistan was acting as a sanctuary. What did our shadow government do? They increased funding to the Pakistan military. This was the same military that was helping to facilitate the CIA drug trafficking operation. But why? More from Der Spiegel. Officially, the U.S. compensated Pakistan for their cooperation in the war on terror and paid for the use of ports and roads for their supplies to Afghanistan. What was wrong with that? Karzai responds. The U.S. was supporting both sides of the conflict at the same time. It was dropping bombs on Afghan villages in order to fight the Taliban, while at the same time funding the very country accused of organizing Taliban terror campaigns. Former U.S. President Donald Trump once announced that America had paid $35 billion to Pakistan over these past 19 years. This contradictory policy cost thousands of Afghan lives, troops and civilians alike. Tell me, how was Afghanistan supposed to come to peace? End quote. Trump wasn't afraid to call out the real enemy and knew that the American people were being forced to fund our enemies. The shadow government was paying Pakistan for the use of ports and roads to supply their private army of freedom fighters who were protecting their heroin trade. Karzai called out the hypocrisy of fighting a war on terror in Afghanistan while funding the country that was promoting that same terrorism. But like most people in the spotlight, he wouldn't mention the CIA drug trafficking that was centered around the whole war. More from Der Spiegel. When it comes down to it, who will decide on war or peace, Pakistan's intelligence service or the Taliban? Karzai responds. Ultimately, the Taliban are also Afghans, and I hope they will stand up to foreign influences where necessary, such as in Pakistan. My appeal to Afghans, including the Taliban, is that we come together and finally take our fate into our own hands against all foreign powers. End quote. Who was the real enemy? Was it the Taliban? Or was it Pakistan? All of the terrorism coming from Afghanistan was being fueled by Pakistan, which was being controlled by the CIA shadow government. Pakistan is the key that opens several doors. In my next article, I will dive deep into Pakistan and the connections to the CIA and Saudi Arabia that helped lead to the creation of Al-Qaeda. I will also reveal an even bigger threat worldwide that Trump took head on, which has already changed the course of history. And that is Joe Lange. Joe Lange from badlands.substack.com. I would like to say a big thank you to Joe Lange for writing the piece, and Ash in America. Both of you put in chats into X. This is exclusively on X right now. If you are interested in supporting what I do here, go to www.epicminerals.net. That's www.epicminerals.net. You may not believe it, but you are completely lousy with heavy metals right now, guys. And that is why we have zeolite spray. Check this out.
He said something that really hit home about this phenomena of chemtrails.
Manganese will make you kill your mama. How much manganese are you spraying in my neighborhood at night while I'm asleep?
Military and some commercial jets have been fitted with huge barrels of at least 49 different kinds of documented chemical poisons. Barium is toxic to all mammals. Aluminum is known to diminish kidney function and destroy brain cells and cognitive function. A problem, a serious problem.
Patent number 5003186 describes cooling the Earth with metal oxides sprayed into the stratosphere.
And I thought, well, geez, this is what I do for a living. I was finding tons and tons of large quantities of aluminum, barium, strontium in the forms of oxides and sulfates. Instead of protecting the people, we are poisoning the people.
Detox and prevent heavy metal poisoning. www.epicminerals.net. Promo code Badlands. That's right, guys. Check it out. Zeolite Extra. The reviews are coming in for Zeolite Extra. We've got 37 5-star reviews. The The reviews that are less than 5 stars are all just people bitching about the product not being there yet. So 4.76 out of 5 stars based on 42 reviews. People are reporting that their minds are clearer, that they're sleeping better, that they have more energy. Why? Because you got toxins all throughout your system, and it's not just heavy metals. In addition, you can also support what I do here by going to the Epic Moisture section at epicminerals.net. The body butter also contains apricot kernel oil, which is a huge source of Laetrile, also known as vitamin B17, another detoxifying agent. And guys, I mean, it just soaks right into your skin like nothing I've ever seen before. So check that out, epicminerals.net, promo code Shapiro to pry $1 from my grasping hands. So this is exclusively on X right now. I will be putting it up on Rumble and other platforms later. But for now, I'm going to try this whole exclusive to X stuff. So do me a big favor and follow me on Twitter. That is at pgunnels1. I should probably put that in my name tag. But also thank you to Charlotte York for jumping in there for me on the chat. I am understanding that figuring out how to put a chat into X is not the easiest thing in the world, and I really love hearing from you on the chat. So I really want to see if we can maybe train the audience to click on that stuff, because interacting with the chat is a huge part of what we do here. Anyway, thank you everybody for watching, and I hope to do a lot more of these. In the meantime, let us pray. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. I love you all. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you tomorrow.